She has counted 47 letters in her lifetime. 47 letters she wrote and never once heard answered. And now, standing in her doorway with the rain soaking through her shawl, Clara Whitmore is looking at a ribbon she recognizes, before her mind will let her recognize the man holding it. The lane outside her cottage in Milbeck does not see carriages like this one. It sees farm carts, and the miller's cob pulling his flour wagon, and on a good Sunday, the vicar's aging mare. It does not see a black carriage with a crest half hidden by mud, drawn by two matched horses, too fine and too tall for a Yorkshire lane in the rain. And yet there it stands, its wheels sunk to the axle in the wet track outside her gate, steam rising faintly from the horse's flanks into the cold evening air. A man is already climbing down from it. He moves carefully, the way a person moves when an old injury has taught his body caution it did not used to need. He is tall, and his coat is plain gray, unremarkable, the sort of coat a country solicitor might wear. Except that everything else about him, the set of his shoulders, the quality of his boots, the stillness with which he stands once his feet find the mud, says otherwise. Rain has plastered his dark hair flat against his forehead. She cannot see his face clearly yet. She does not need to. Her eyes have already gone to what he is carrying. He holds it against his chest with both hands, the way a man holds something he has carried a very long way and does not trust himself to set down. A bundle of paper, worn soft at the corners, tied with a ribbon that was once a deep, defiant blue and has since faded to the color of a Yorkshire sky in November. Clara's candle gutters behind her in the draft from the open door. She does not step back inside, and she does not step forward. She stands exactly where she is, one hand white-knuckled on the frame, and she feels something in her chest that she has spent 2 years teaching herself not to feel, rising up now with no permission asked at all. She has told herself, more times than she can count, that hope is a debt a poor woman cannot afford to keep paying interest on. She told herself this the night she wrote letter number 1, cold and hopeful and certain it would matter to someone. She told herself this again on the night, many months later, when she numbered a letter in the high 30s with hands that had stopped quite believing anyone would ever read it. She has spent 2 years closing that account, piece by piece, teaching her own heart to stop expecting a reply. And here, on a rain-soaked evening with mud swallowing a stranger's boots outside her gate, the whole ledger opens itself back up in a single breath, and Clara Whitmore finds she cannot make her mouth form a single word. The man stops a few feet from her door. He looks up, finally, into the light spilling from her single candle, and for one long moment, neither of them moves, and neither of them speaks, and the rain falls into the silence between them, the way it has been falling, she will later think, since the very first letter she ever wrote, into a silence she believed would never answer. We'll leave her there a moment longer, in the doorway, in the rain, with her whole heart caught somewhere between her throat and her hands, because you deserve to know exactly who is standing at that gate, and why it took him 2 years and 47 silences to finally knock on this door. If you're the kind of listener who likes to sit with a story until the very last candle burns down, I would love it if you'd subscribe right now, so you're here for every letter, every heartbreak, and the moment this whole story turns. And if you leave before you learn who Clara Whitmore was really writing to all this time, well, you already owe me a favor, and I fully intend to collect it. Now let me take you back to where this began, not to the rain, and not even to the letters themselves. Let me take you back to a cold schoolroom in Yorkshire, a stack of blank paper on a scarred wooden desk, and a young woman who never once expected her own small kindness to change the course of a duke's entire life. Clara Whitmore had been the schoolmistress of Milbeck for 2 years by the time the war took her small corner of England as thoroughly as it took every other, and in all that time, no one in the village had ever thought to ask her what she wanted for herself. She was the parson's daughter, and that had always been description enough for the people around her. Useful, respectable, unmarried, and quietly, permanently, in the background of every room she occupied. She was 24 years old the winter this story begins. Her father, the Reverend Edmund Whitmore, had held the Milbeck parish for 30 years, and Clara had grown up in the shadow of his pulpit, the way other girls grew up in the shadow of an orchard tree, sheltered by it, shaped by it, and never quite able to see past its branches to imagine a life of her own that did not orbit somebody else's needs. She taught the village children their letters and their sums in a schoolroom with a stove that smoked more than it warmed, and in the evenings she took in mending by candlelight to make her small wages stretch, her fingers going stiff with cold long before the sewing basket ever emptied. She was not unhappy exactly. She simply lived a life sized to exactly what other people believed she deserved, and by the age of 24, she had very nearly stopped noticing that the size had ever been chosen by anyone other than herself. I want you to picture her precisely as she was in that first winter, because the woman who would one day stand in a rain-soaked doorway with her whole heart in her throat was built entirely out of what happened to the schoolmistress I am about to describe to you. She had her father's steady hand for figures and her mother's soft, unhurried voice, and she had spent the whole of her quiet life believing, without ever quite examining the belief, that being useful was the closest thing to being loved that a woman without a dowry could reasonably expect. She was about to discover, through a stack of paper and a war she had no part in fighting, exactly how much more than that she had actually wanted all along. It began, as so many small things do, with a notice pinned to the door of the village church, a call from a charitable society in Leeds, asking any literate parishioner willing to spare an evening to write letters of comfort to wounded soldiers who had no family of their own to write to them. Most of the village read the notice and walked on. Clara read it twice, and then a third time, and something in her chest, some old and unnamed hunger, told her before her mind had finished deciding that she would be writing that very night. She did not tell herself it was loneliness. She told herself it was Christian charity, the same charity her father had preached from that same pulpit every Sunday of her life. But if she had been entirely honest with herself, and Clara Whitmore was, in most things, ruthlessly honest with herself, even when it cost her comfort to be so, she would have admitted that some part of her simply wanted, for once, to send words out into the world and imagine them landing somewhere they mattered. She had spent her whole life being useful to people who already knew her name. She wanted, just this once, to matter to a stranger. That first night, she sat at the small table in her father's study, long after the rest of the parsonage had gone dark, and she addressed her letter not to a name, because she had none, but simply to whichever soldier has none to write to him. She wrote about the frost that had crept across the schoolroom windows that morning, in patterns so fine and so briefly beautiful that she had let the children stop their lessons for a full 5 minutes simply to look at it. She wrote that she did not know whether these words would ever be read, or whether they would do a single scrap of good against whatever a man in a hospital bed was truly suffering, but that she could not bear the thought of one more soldier lying somewhere in England, believing that no one at home was thinking of him. She signed it only C. Whitmore, folded it twice, and in the corner, in her small, careful hand, she wrote the number 1, a private habit she had carried since girlhood, numbering things that mattered to her, as though a number might make a fragile thing feel more solid, more built, more likely to still be standing in the morning. She did not know, could not have known, that 4 counties away, in a military hospital in Portsmouth, a young officer who had not spoken a kind word to anyone in 11 weeks was about to have that exact letter read aloud to him by a tired orderly with a stack of unclaimed post and nowhere else to put it. His name, when the world outside that hospital ward used it at all, was His Grace, Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Ravenshire, 31 years old, master of 3 estates, a seat in the House of Lords waiting for him whenever he chose to reclaim it, and, before the war, a reputation so cold and so carefully guarded that grown men had learned to measure their words twice before they spoke to him. He had not been cruel, precisely. He had simply spent his entire adult life being courted, flattered, and quietly maneuvered around by people who wanted something from the title before they had ever troubled themselves to want anything from the man attached to it, and he had built, over years, a wall so thorough that even he sometimes forgot there was a person still living behind it. He had gone to Portsmouth as Captain Ashcombe. It had not begun as a deception, not truly, merely a quiet accommodation, arranged through an old family friend serving as the hospital's administrator, so that a wounded man might be nursed like any other wounded man, without the fuss and performance that his true rank would have summoned into every ward he occupied. He had not expected the accommodation to matter to him. He had certainly not expected it to become, in time, the single thing he was most afraid to lose. He had been struck by shrapnel at Toulouse in the war's last brutal weeks, a wound that should not, by every account the surgeons gave him, have taken his sight, and yet the fever that followed had done exactly that, stealing the light from him for the better part of a year, while his body slowly, stubbornly, refused to die. He lay in a ward of men more broken than himself in some ways, and less broken in others, and he had learned, in those first blind months, a version of helplessness no dukedom had ever prepared him for. It was into this particular darkness that Corporal Higgins, the orderly assigned to his row of cots, began each week to read aloud whatever charity post had arrived for the men who had no family of their own to write to them. Julian had ordered him, the first time, not to trouble him with the sentimental scribblings of well-meaning strangers. He had meant it as a dismissal. Higgins, who had nursed enough proud, wounded men to know when a command was worth obeying and when it was worth quietly ignoring, read the letter anyway. He read it to the row, not only to Julian, to Private Thomas Reed in the next cot, who had lost an arm at the same battle and had taken, since, to a silence nearly as complete as blindness, and to old Sergeant Dobbs, 2 cots down, who claimed to have no interest whatsoever in a schoolteacher's frost and asked, every single week after, whether another letter had come. What struck Julian first was not tenderness, because he did not trust tenderness, not from a stranger, not from anyone. What struck him was the plainness of it, the fact that she had admitted outright that she did not know whether her words would do any good at all, rather than pretending, as everyone in his own life had always pretended, to certainties they did not actually possess. He had spent his whole life surrounded by people entirely certain of what he wanted to hear. This woman, whoever she was, 4 counties away, and utterly unaware that a duke lay listening, had simply told the truth and let it stand on its own thin legs. He said nothing to Higgins about it that first night, but when Private Reed, moved despite himself, asked to have the frost passage read again before the candle was put out, Julian did not object. And when, a week later, Higgins arrived with no new letter and the ward fell into a silence heavier than usual, it was Julian, cold, unreadable, famously indifferent Julian Ashcombe, who found himself asking, in a voice he did not entirely recognize as his own, whether anything had come. Something had begun, in that dim Portsmouth ward, that neither of them had chosen, and neither of them, not yet, understood. Clara Whitmore believed she was riding into an empty room. Julian Ashcombe was listening from inside it, and for the first time since he was a boy young enough not to know what his own name was worth, he was beginning, letter by letter, to be heard for exactly who he was and nothing else. The letter that followed number 1 was not, strictly speaking, a reply. Clara had no name to reply to, no address to send further words toward except the same charitable society in Leeds that had posted the original notice, and so she did the only thing that made sense to a woman raised on parish economics. She kept writing, faithfully, into the same uncertain silence, and she let the society forward each one wherever it judged the need to be greatest. It was Corporal Higgins, in the end, who quietly arranged that letter number 2, and every letter after it, be routed directly to the row of cots that held Captain Ashcombe, Private Reed, and Sergeant Dobbs, not out of any grand design, but because he had watched 3 wounded men come more alive during a 5-minute reading than during any other 5 minutes of their long convalescence, and a good orderly learns to protect whatever keeps his patients tethered to living. Clara had no notion any of this was happening. She sat at her father's desk each week. By a single tallow candle she rationed carefully to stretch through 7 nights, and she wrote about whatever small, true thing had happened in her small, true life. A child in her schoolroom who had finally, after months of struggle, read a full sentence aloud without stumbling. The particular blue of a winter sky just before snow, the ache in her own hands from mending by poor light. She never asked her soldier's name. She had decided early on that asking would turn a kindness into an obligation, and she wanted this correspondence to remain exactly what it had begun as, a gift given freely, expecting nothing returned. And in the corner of every letter, before she sealed it, she wrote its number: letter number 4, letter number 9, letter number 15. A private ritual that made the growing, uncertain thing between herself and a stranger feel, however slightly, like something being built, rather than something being cast out into the dark and hoped for. What she could not have known, what would have astonished her entirely, had anyone told her, was that on the other end of that silence, a duke of the realm had begun to live for Thursday evenings, when the week's post arrived, the way other men lived for the promise of a homecoming. Julian did not write back. This was, at first, simple practicality. His hands, badly burned along with the rest of him at Toulouse, could not yet manage a pen, and his eyes, when they worked at all in those early months, could not have read his own reply, even if he had managed to scratch one out. But as the months passed and his hands slowly healed enough to hold a spoon, then a fork, then eventually a pen, he found himself still not writing, and the reason had stopped being practical and become something far more complicated to admit. He did not know how to explain, in a letter, who he actually was. He had let the assumption stand for so long now, soldier, not duke, captain, not grace, that correcting it felt, each week he failed to correct it, like a lie growing heavier, rather than a misunderstanding growing simpler. And beneath that fear sat a second one, quieter, and far more dangerous to a man who had spent his whole adult life guarding against exactly this feeling. He was afraid that the moment Whitmore learned what he actually was, the letters would stop being written to a man at all, and start being written, however unconsciously, to a title. He had spent 31 years being wanted for his rank. He was not yet ready to lose the one correspondence in his life that had never once asked him for anything. So he stayed silent, and he listened, week after week, as Higgins read him a stranger's ordinary, unguarded life. And somewhere in the 11th month of his recovery, somewhere around letter number 22, Julian Ashcombe understood, with the particular clarity that comes to a man who has nothing left to do but lie in the dark and think, that he had fallen in love with a woman he had never seen, based on nothing but the plain, unpretending truth of her handwriting read aloud by another man's voice. It was very shortly after this understanding arrived that the fever came back. It came the way fevers so often did in that overcrowded ward, quietly at first, a warmth in his skin that the surgeons dismissed as nothing, and then, within days, a heat so total that Julian lost track of where his own body ended, and the burning began. When it finally broke, 3 weeks later, it took with it what little sight he had managed to recover. He woke to darkness so complete he could not, for the first several minutes, understand that his eyes were even open. He could not write. He had never truly learned to write again after Toulouse, and now there was nothing left to relearn toward. No light by which a hand might find a line. No way to see whether the pen had even touched the page. And he could not explain any of this to the one person whose silence, he now understood with a terrible clarity, would be the loudest thing in his life, if it ever fell. 4 counties away, Clara felt that silence arrived exactly the way silences always arrive to people who have been quietly, faithfully hoping, not all at once, but slowly, letter by letter, as the weeks between any acknowledgement of her letters stretched from occasional to constant. She had never received a reply, not truly, not in the sense of words written back to her, but she had, for a long while, received the small comfort of knowing, through the society's occasional word, that her letters were being read and welcomed somewhere. Now even that thin comfort dried up. She told herself he had likely been moved to another hospital, or discharged home to a family who could care for him properly, and that this was good news dressed as an ending. She told herself this on the night she wrote letter number 30, and she told herself this again on the night she wrote letter number 35, her hand growing less certain each time, though her numbers, stubbornly, never stopped climbing. Somewhere around letter number 40, she allowed herself, once, in the privacy of her own father's study with the door closed and the candle burned low, to consider that the silence might mean the worst thing a silence from a hospital could mean. She did not cry for long. She had learned by then exactly how much grief she could afford in an evening and still rise the next morning to teach a room full of children their letters, and she rationed it the same way she rationed her candle. She kept writing anyway. This was not stubbornness for its own sake, though the village would later call it exactly that, unkindly, to her face. It was something closer to a vow she had made to herself in that very first letter, that she could not bear the thought of one more soldier believing himself forgotten. And a vow, to a woman raised by a parson to believe that a promise made was a debt owed, did not simply dissolve because the debt had stopped being repaid. Julian, meanwhile, was fighting a battle no surgeon in that hospital could see. His sight returned in slow, partial stages over the following months. Shapes first, then light and shadow, then finally, painstakingly, letters on a page held close enough to his face that Higgins had to guide his hand to the words. And the first thing he did, the very first time he could make out a line of handwriting on his own, was ask for every one of Clara's letters to be brought to him, and he read them again and again, committing them to memory the way a starving man commits the location of bread, because he could not yet trust his own recovering eyes not to fail him again, and he was not, this time, willing to lose her words along with his sight. It was during this same stretch of slow, private recovery that the first crack appeared in the wall Julian had built around his own name. A militia officer passing through the hospital on other business, a man with a taste for gossip and no particular loyalty to discretion, happened to remark, within earshot of a nurse who happened to have family in the West Riding, that a Captain Ashcombe recovering in Ward 9 was queer for an officer of his standing, all things considered, and that certain quiet arrangements had clearly been made on his behalf by someone with far more influence than a captain's pay could explain. The remark meant nothing to the nurse at the time. It would mean a great deal, months later, to a woman in a Yorkshire village inn, who happened to overhear its far end of the same idle gossip trail, carried by the same loose-tongued officer, now passing through her own parish entirely by chance. But that reckoning was still ahead. For now, Julian lay in a hospital bed, slowly regaining his sight and his strength, holding a stack of another woman's honest words, as though they were the only solid ground left in a world that had spent 31 years teaching him nothing could be trusted. And he began, for the first time since the war took him, to plan not his return to his estates, not his return to the House of Lords, but his return to the one door in England he had never seen and could not stop thinking about. He was not strong enough to travel for many months yet, and in those months, Clara's own world in Milbeck, unprotected by any knowledge of what was slowly mending 4 counties away, was about to come apart entirely. Her father died in the early spring, quite suddenly, of a chill that turned to fever in the space of a single terrible week, and Clara found herself, at 24, an orphan with no income of her own, and a distant cousin, Mr. Silas Whitmore, arriving within the fortnight to claim the parsonage that had been her only home. Silas was not a cruel man by his own estimation, only a practical one, and practicality, in his hands, looked very much like informing Clara within her first month of mourning that her place under his roof was a temporary courtesy, contingent entirely on her usefulness and her silence. She kept teaching, she kept mending by candlelight in the evenings, and she kept writing, faithfully, numbering each letter as she always had, though the numbers had begun, by then, to feel less like something she was building and more like a private grief she alone still tended. It was in the village inn, some weeks after her father's death, that the same idle-tongued militia officer who had once gossiped in a Portsmouth ward happened to be passing through the West Riding on his way north, and happened to mention, over ale and to no one in particular, a curious tale of a captain in Portsmouth who had turned out to be a great deal more than a captain. Clara was not meant to hear it. She was fetching thread for her cousin's mending and stood near enough, by pure accident, to catch the shape of it, a name half caught, Ashcombe, and a rank that did not match the whispered scale of the man's true consequence. She did not understand that evening what she had overheard. She had no name of her own soldier to attach it to, no proof, nothing but a small, cold seed of doubt planted somewhere she had not thought to guard. But it sat with her in the weeks that followed, the first suggestion that the silence she had been grieving might not have been the silence of a dying man at all, but the silence of a man who had never told her the whole truth of who he was to begin with. And it was that same season, with grief and doubt both sitting heavy in her chest, that Silas Whitmore, tired of a cousin he considered an ongoing expense, began telling the parish a very different story about her, one in which there had never been a wounded soldier at all, only a lonely, fanciful woman who had invented a correspondence to win herself sympathy she had not earned. The village, which had once admired her charity, now murmured behind gloved hands that Clara Whitmore was either a liar or a fool, and offered her, in either case, considerably less kindness than it had offered before. You know that particular ache, don't you, of being disbelieved about the one thing you have never once lied about? That is exactly the position Clara now found herself in, grieving a father, doubting a silence, and defending a truth no one in her village was willing to hear. And it is precisely where her story is about to turn its cruelest corner before it can turn toward the door in the rain. Silas moved quickly once the whispers had done their work. Within a month he had given notice that the parsonage could no longer house her. Keeping what little remained of her father's modest savings under the pretense of settling debts Clara never saw an accounting for, and leaving her with nothing beyond a single small room she rented, at considerable cost to her pride, from the miller's widow at the edge of the village. It was in that same difficult season that Silas, eager to be rid of the burden entirely, began pressing her toward a match with a widower twice her age, a man of unpleasant reputation and considerable local land, purely, as Silas put it plainly, to see her settled somewhere that was not his own household. Clara refused. She refused quietly, without drama, the way she did most things, but she refused with a firmness that surprised even her cousin, because whatever else had been taken from her that year, her home, her father, her good name in the eyes of a village that no longer trusted her, she was not yet prepared to trade away the last of her own choosing for the comfort of a roof she did not want. It was a letter, ironically, that very nearly reached her during this darkest stretch and might have changed everything months sooner. Julian, his sight recovered enough at last to trust his own hand, had finally written, not through Higgins, not through the society, but directly, a letter meant to explain everything, his name, his rank, the whole shape of the silence he had let stand for so long. It was misdirected by a careless clerk at the War Office, addressed to a parish 2 counties distant that shared half of Milbeck's name, and it never reached her at all. Clara, waiting for nothing because she had long since stopped believing there was anything left to wait for, never knew it had been sent. She believed, by the time autumn came again, that the soldier she had written to was dead, that her cousin had ruined what remained of her name for nothing, and that the small, private hope she had carried through 2 years of letters had finally, completely, run out of road. She did not yet know that 4 counties away, a duke who had spent months regaining his strength for exactly this purpose, was already climbing into a carriage, a bundle of 47 letters tied with a faded blue ribbon held against his chest, beginning a journey through 4 counties of autumn rain to find a door he had never seen, belonging to a woman he had never once been given the chance to fail in person, only in silence, and only, he now understood, because he had let his own fear decide for both of them for far too long. Julian's search took him longer than he had allowed himself to hope. He had only ever known her as C. Whitmore, schoolteacher, daughter of a parson, somewhere in the West Riding of Yorkshire, fragments gathered from her own letters and, eventually, from the same loose-tongued militia officer whose gossip had once nearly unraveled everything, tracked down and questioned with a directness that surprised the man considerably, given who was asking. He traveled through 4 counties that autumn, following threads that led nowhere, parishes that had no Whitmore among their registers, schoolrooms with the wrong teacher entirely, and each failed lead cost him something he had not expected searching to cost, not merely time, but a slow, humbling erosion of the certainty that had carried him through 31 years, as a duke accustomed to getting precisely what he wanted, precisely when he wanted it. He had never had to search for anything in his life the way he was searching now, with no rank able to hurry it, and no fortune able to buy it faster. And somewhere in the 3rd county he understood, with something like relief mixed into the frustration, that this too was part of what he owed her, the plain, unglamorous effort of a man finding his own way to a door, rather than simply summoning her to his. It was in the 4th county, in a market town not far from Milbeck, that he finally heard the story whole. A school teacher, recently orphaned, recently disgraced by a cousin's slander over a soldier's letters no one believed had ever existed. Julian did not need to hear another word. He had the carriage turned toward Milbeck before the innkeeper telling the tale had even finished it, and he traveled the last stretch of road in a rain that had not let up since noon, his own hands, healed now but still faintly scarred from Toulouse, wrapped around a bundle of letters he had not let out of his sight since Portsmouth. Which brings us, at last, back to the doorway where we began. Clara's room above the miller's was small and plainly furnished. A single window looking out over the wet lane, a narrow bed, a table just large enough for her mending basket, and her one remaining candle. It was here, on that same rain-soaked evening, that Julian stepped inside at last, dripping onto the widow's clean floor, and set the ribbon-bound bundle down on Clara's small table, with a care that made the whole room go very still. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. He had rehearsed 100 versions of this explanation across 4 counties of bad road, and every one of them deserted him now, standing in a room barely large enough for the two of them, watching her look at the bundle on the table the way a person looks at a ghost they had already finished grieving. "Captain Ashcombe," she said finally, and her voice, when it came, was quieter than he had imagined it in 2 years of picturing it, and steadier than he had any right to expect. Or should I say, Your Grace? He did not flinch from it, though everything in him wanted to. "Julian," he said. "My name is Julian. I should have told you that a very long time ago." Something in Clara's chest, some last careful wall she had built over 2 years of grieving a man she had never even properly named, began, at the sound of his actual voice, rougher than she had pictured, worn at the edges by fever and rain, to come apart entirely. But she did not let it show yet. She had spent too many months learning to hold her own face still, while everyone around her decided what to believe about her, and she was not yet ready to hand her whole heart over simply because the silence had finally answered. "You let me believe you were dead," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands, pressed flat against her skirts, were trembling badly enough that she had to press them harder to still them. "I wrote to you when I had nothing else in the world worth writing toward. I wrote to you when my own cousin stood in front of half this village and called me a liar for it, and I kept writing, because I had made myself a promise long before I ever knew your name, and I do not break my promises, whatever else has been taken from me this year. And you let me bury a man who was never in the ground at all." Julian did not defend himself. He had told himself, across 4 counties, that he would not defend himself, that whatever explanation he owed her, he owed it plainly, without the polish a duke's tongue could so easily reach for. "I did not tell you," he said, "because for the first time in my life, someone was writing to a man and not to a title, and I was afraid, more afraid than I have ever been of anything, including the war itself, that the moment you knew what I truly was, I would lose the only thing I had left that felt entirely, honestly mine." "That is not an excuse," Clara said. "No," he agreed. "It is not. It is only the truth, which is the very least I owe you, and which I should have given you a great deal sooner than this. I do not want your title, Your Grace," she said. And here, at last, her voice did catch, just once, before she steadied it by what looked like sheer will alone. "I never wanted your fortune, and I certainly never wrote a single one of those letters hoping a duke would one day appear at my door in the rain to rescue me from a life you had no hand in ruining, until your silence let my cousin ruin it for you. I wanted to know that 47 letters meant something to someone. That is all I ever wanted, and I have spent 2 years believing they meant nothing at all." She stepped to the table then, and with hands that were still trembling, she lifted the topmost letter from the bundle, letter number 1, in her own careful, 2 years younger hand, and held it out to him. Not gently, not as a gift. She held it out the way a person hands over a fact that can no longer be denied, and she waited, refusing, for the first time in this entire correspondence, to be the one who filled the silence between them. Julian took it from her with a hand that was not entirely steady either. He looked down at his own name, no, at her handwriting addressing no name at all, whichever soldier has none to write to him, and something in his chest, some wall he had spent 31 years reinforcing against exactly this kind of undoing, finally gave way completely. He pressed the letter briefly against his chest, exactly where he had carried the whole bundle against him for 4 counties of rain, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost every last trace of a duke's composure. "Forgive me," he said. "I should have come much sooner." Clara said nothing. She stood very still, watching him, waiting to see whether there was more beneath the apology than the apology itself. "Your letters were the only thing I read," he went on. "In the months I could not see anything else at all. I had them read to me until I had every word by memory, long before I could hold a pen again to answer you. And when my sight came back, and I read letter number 22 for the 100th time with my own 2 eyes, I understood that I had fallen in love with you based on nothing but the plain truth of your own handwriting, and that every mile of the search that finally brought me to this door was the only entirely honest thing I have done since the war took me. I am not asking you to forgive 2 years in a single evening. I am only asking you to believe that the silence was never once indifference. It was fear, and it was mine to overcome, not yours to have suffered for." The rain went on falling outside the small window, loud against the glass, loud against the miller's wheel turning somewhere below. Clara looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had been, for 2 years, nothing but a hopeful sentence written into the dark, and who now stood in front of her, entirely real, entirely flawed, and entirely honest, for what she suspected was the first time in his adult life. She did not weep in front of him. She did not run to him either, not yet. She simply reached out and took the letter back from his hand, and set it down again, gently this time, on top of the bundle, the way a person sets down a thing they have decided, at last, to keep. You feel that, don't you? The particular relief of a silence finally answering back, after so long spent believing it never would. That is exactly where Clara Whitmore stood in that small rented room, and it is exactly the ground on which everything that followed would finally, properly, begin to be built. What Julian did next was not, in the end, the private, discreet correction that a man of his rank might so easily have chosen instead. He did not quietly settle matters with Silas Whitmore through solicitors and money, the swift, comfortable solution that would have protected his own name, while leaving Clara's public disgrace to fade, unremarked, on its own slow schedule. He understood, standing in that small room, that her injury had been public, the whispers, the slander, the loss of her position and her home, all of it played out in front of a village that had chosen to believe the worst of her. And so, he told her plainly, her restoration would have to be equally public, or it would not be restoration at all. It would simply be one more quiet favor, extended by a powerful man to a woman he pitied, and Clara Whitmore, he had come to understand across 2 years of her honest letters, deserved a great deal better than pity. The parish hall in Milbeck had never held a gathering quite like the one Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Ravenshire, requested the following week. No ceremony, no announcement of rank beforehand, only a quiet word sent to the vicar that the village should assemble, because a matter concerning Miss Whitmore required correcting in front of the very people who had helped it go wrong. Silas arrived, expecting to insult a mysterious stranger, and left, within minutes, thoroughly undone. Julian stood before the assembled village, without any of the ceremony his title might have demanded, and told them plainly that Clara Whitmore's letters had saved his courage, and very possibly his life, in a season when nothing else in England could reach him at all. He told them of the frost on schoolroom windows, of a child who had finally read a full sentence aloud, of 2 years of small, true, unglamorous kindness sent into what she had every reason to believe was an empty room. And he told them, in the same plain voice, that Silas Whitmore had taken his cousin's inheritance under false pretense, and had slandered her good name to cover the theft, and he would see both put right before he left the county. Silas was compelled, before witnesses he could not later argue away, to restore what he had taken. The village that had so recently called Clara a liar or a fool now found itself considerably more careful in its whispers, and Clara Whitmore's reputation, so thoroughly dismantled over a single hard year, was rebuilt in the space of a single honest afternoon. Private Reed and Sergeant Dobbs, the two wounded men who had once passed a stranger's letter, hand to hand down a Portsmouth ward simply for the comfort of hearing it read twice, were given positions on the Ravenshire estate before the month was out. A quiet debt, Julian said, that had been owed a great deal longer than the one to Clara herself. It was some weeks later, in Clara's small room above the miller's, with the same ribbon retied neatly around the same worn bundle, that Julian laid the letters between them once more, and asked her, without a speech prepared and without a ring offered first, whether every letter still to be written between them, every ordinary Thursday and every small true thing yet to happen to either of them, might belong to her for the rest of both their lives. Clara did not answer him with words at first. She reached instead for a single sheet of paper she had kept folded at the bottom of her mending basket for over a year, a 48th letter, written on the night she had believed him dead and never sent, because she had not known, then, where in the world it could possibly go. She read it aloud to him now, by candlelight, the words she had once written only for her own grieving heart to hear, and Julian Ashcombe listened to every line the way a man listens to the one thing in his life that has never once been written to his title. In the end, this was never really a story about a duke, or even about a soldier. It was about what happens when a woman's quiet, unglamorous loyalty, the kind that no one applauds and no one repays, is finally answered. Clara Whitmore never wrote those 47 letters hoping to be rescued. She wrote them because she could not bear to let one more person believe themselves forgotten. And in the end, that very thing was what saved her too. Perhaps that is why you stayed with me until the last letter was read tonight, because some part of you is waiting, the way she was, to learn that your own quiet kindnesses have not gone unnoticed after all. If you're still here with me, subscribe, and let me be the one who tells you the next story, and the one after that. And if you leave now, before the ribbon is retied one final time, well, you already know exactly what you owe me, because somewhere, in a small Yorkshire cottage, the rain has finally stopped falling outside a door that, at last, no longer has to wait for an answer.